Let us now continue our discussion of rapidly progressive crescentic glomerulonephritis. So just to recall, we have three types. The first one is type 1 anti-GBM. The second one is type 2 immune complex associated. And then type 3 would be your posi-immune or ANCA associated RPGN. When you look at the kidneys, in RPGN, the kidneys are expected to be enlarged and pale. Usually, they exhibit petechial hemorrhages on the cortical surface. So depending on the underlying cause, which as I have mentioned is divided into three, anti-GBM, immune complex, or posi-immune, the glomeruli will often show focal and segmental necrosis and variably will show diffuse or focal endothelial proliferation and mesangial proliferation. This is typically showing you what we call as crescents. So this one is the area of your Bowman's space. And as you can see here, there is proliferation of epithelial cells as well as infiltration of your leukocytes. This then compresses your glomerular tuft. And the crescent-shaped mass that is formed is the reason why we call it as crescentic glomerulonephritis. Crescents, as I have said, are formed by proliferation of glomerular epithelial cells and migration of monocytes and macrophages into the urinary space. Neutrophils and lymphocytes are expected to be present. It then obliterates your Bowman's, and then eventually it assumes a crescentic shape. Hence, that is the reason why it is otherwise known as crescentic glomerulonephritis. On the right-hand side is showing you the immunofluorescence. By IF or immunofluorescence microscopy, the immune complex mediated cases will show granular immune deposits. Goodpasture syndrome cases, however, will show you linear GBM fluorescence for immunoglobulin and complement. And posi-immune cases will have little or no deposition of immune reactants. What I'm showing you right now is a typical then for anti-GBM. You will have crescent formation on H&E, and you're expecting linear pattern on immunofluorescence. Now, the clinical manifestations of all forms of crescentic glomerulonephritis will include hematuria. You will see red cell cast in the urine. Proteinuria is also expected, and hypertension, plus of course edema. So it is more of a nephritic type of presentation. The next entity that I'm going to discuss is what you call as membranous glomerulonephritis. Membranous nephropathy, from the term itself, as you can see here, it is characterized by diffuse thickening of the glomerular capillary wall, which is due to accumulation of deposits containing immunoglobulin along the subepithelial side of the basement membrane. There are many causes, as you can see, ranging from drugs, underlying malignancy, lupus, infectious agents, and metabolic disorder. It is a form of chronic immune complex mediated disease. In secondary membranous nephropathy, the inciting antigens can sometimes be identified in the immune complex. The antigens may be endogenous or exogenous. The endogenous antigens may be renal or non-renal. Membranous nephropathy in SLE is associated with deposition of complexes of self-nuclear proteins and autoantibodies. Exogenous antigens include, for example, those of hepatitis B, Treponema pallidum causing syphilis in patients infected with this microbial organism. So, Usually, the clinical manifestations are as follows. You will have an insidious onset of nephrotic syndrome, followed by hematuria and hypertension. And usually as I have mentioned, this is an example of chronic form of disease. The disorder usually presents again with insidious onset of nephrotic syndrome. The course of the disease is variable but generally indolent. So if you're going to look at the features, by light microscopy, the glomeruli is either appearing normal or the early stages of the disease or exhibit uniform diffuse thickening of the glomerular capillary wall. By electron microscopy, the thickening can be visualized, and this is caused by irregular electron-dense deposits containing immune complexes between the basement membrane and the overlying epithelial cells, with effacement of the foot process. Now, if you are going to do immunostains, like for example, what is mentioned in your book would be your PLA2R or THST7A. Glomerular positivity is expected in majority of patients. The epithelial cells of the proximal tubules may contain reabsorption droplets, and there may be considerable mononuclear cell infiltration. So do not forget, you have marked diffuse thickening of the capillary walls without an increase in the number of cells. You may see prominent spikes of silver staining matrix, which is represented by the arrow projecting from the basement membrane lamina densa towards the urinary space. The electron micrograph usually will be along the deposits will be along the epithelial side of the basement membrane. And the characteristic granular immunofluorescence of deposits of IgG along the GBM is what is the expected result. The next entity is called minimal change. From the term itself, it is relatively benign. It is usually characterized by diffuse effacement of the foot process of visceral epithelial cells. So if you would recall, this is basically on the podocyte side. The effacement of the foot process is detectable by electron microscopy. It is called minimal change, and so it should also remind you that the glomeruli may appear normal by light microscopy. It is regarded as the most common cause of nephrotic syndrome in children. Despite the massive proteinuria, renal function remains good, and there is usually no hypertension or hematuria. So it is more of proteinuria. It is characteristically responding well to corticosteroid therapy. Usually, children with this kind of disease responds rapidly to corticosteroids. Now, the pathogenesis, there is absence of immune complex deposits in the glomerulus. There are several features, though, that point that these diseases still do have an immunologic basis. Why? Because it is usually associated with a number of atopic disorders, as you can see, and as what I have enumerated. It is, again, as I have mentioned, very responsive to corticosteroids and other immunosuppressive therapy. There is increased prevalence of certain HLA haplotypes, particularly those associated with atopy, suggesting somewhat a genetic predisposition. There is an increased incidence of minimal change disease in patients with Hodgkin's lymphoma, in which the defects of T-cell mediated immunity are well recognized. So these are the reason why, although there is absence of immune deposits in the glomerulus, it still points out that this disease do have an immunologic basis. So what are we looking at? When you look at it under the microscope, the glomerulus by light microscopy is expected to be normal looking. By electron microscopy, the GBM appears normal. However, the principal lesion is, of course, as I have already mentioned, the visceral epithelial cells will exhibit uniform and diffuse effacement. Now, as I have mentioned, the predominant manifestation of this patient would then be proteinuria. And of course, the age group is particularly seen among children. So do not forget, massive proteinuria. Almost always, there is no accompanying hypertension or hematuria. They have a very good response, I have already mentioned, to corticosteroid. Now, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. So if you will recall, a while ago, I was talking about the localization of the complex. Are they focal? Are they diffuse? Okay, so here we have an example of focal segmental. Primary focal segmental is the most common cause of nephrotic syndrome in adults in the US. It is considered to be a primary disorder of podocytes, like minimal change disease. It is characterized by sclerosis, as you can see from the term itself, but not all glomeruli. That's why it is called focal. And in the affected glomeruli, only a portion of the glomerular tuft is involved. Hence, it is called as segmental. There are different types. It may be idiopathic, primary disease that is idiopathic. It is associated with other conditions as it is enumerated here. Sometimes it is regarded to be related to something that is inherited or congenital form. The disease may be caused by mutations in genes that encode proteins localized to the slit diaphragm. For example, podocin, alpha-actinin 4, and TRPC6, which is your transient receptor potential calcium channel 6. Idiopathic accounts for 10 to 35% of cases of nephrotic syndrome in children and adults. So as I have mentioned, look at the image. Not all the glomeruli will be involved, hence the term is focal. And if the glomerulus is involved, only a portion of the glomerulus is exhibiting the changes, hence the term segmental. So in this case, this is the area of involvement. So you have your focal segmental glomerulonephritis. The characteristic change or the epithelial damage is characteristically degeneration and focal disruption of visceral epithelial cells with effacement of the foot process, which resembles what we saw in the minimal change disease. So by light microscopy, as I was saying, you are expecting focal and segmental lesions, which may involve only a minority of the glomerulus. On electron microscopy, you will see the sclerotic and non-sclerotic areas, and of course, the diffuse effacement of foot process. So the next one would be your membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis. MPGN is best considered a pattern of immune-mediated injury rather than a specific disease. It is classifying, the disease is classified into two groups. One is type 1 and the other one is type 2. Most patients with primary MPGN present in adolescents or as young adults with nephrotic syndrome and a nephritic component manifested by hematuria or more insidiously as mild proteinuria. Few remissions occur spontaneously in either type. Now, As I was saying, usually there's a combination of nephrotic with nephritic component. About 50% will develop chronic renal failure within 10 years. Treatment with steroids, immunosuppressive agents, and antiplatelet drugs have not proven to be of benefit. So we have, as I have said, types. So the first one is what we call as type 1. It is characterized by deposition of immune complexes containing IgG and complement. And the second type will be your type 2. Type 2, otherwise known as dense deposit disease, in which activation of complement appears to be the most important factor. This is otherwise or belongs to what we call as C3 glomerulopathies. So MPGN is characterized by alteration in the glomerular basement membrane, accumulation of mesangial matrix, okay, proliferation of glomerular cells, leukocyte infiltration, and the presence of deposits in the mesangial regions and glomerular capillary wall. Now, in most cases, let's go back here. Type 1 MPGN, there is evidence of immune complexes in the glomerulus and activation of both classical and alternative complement pathways. The antigens involved in idiopathic MPGN are unknown. By H&E, since we have all of this mesangial cell proliferation, increased mesangial matrix, and as I have said, basement membrane thickening with influx of leukocytes, you are then expecting that the glomerulus would appear somewhat enlarged and hypercellular. The enlargement and hypercellularity is produced by both the proliferation of cells in the mesangium and, of course, as I have said, by infiltrating leukocytes. Now, the pattern, as we have seen in the image, type 1, again, let us try to recall, is subendothelial electron-dense deposits. Immunofluorescence, IgG and C3 are deposited in granular pattern, and early complement components are often also present. Now, for MPGN type 2, again, it will also give you a granular type of take-up in immunofluorescence. It is often called as double contour or tram track because the GBM is thickened. The appearance is more evident when you employ special stain like silver or periodic acid shift. The appearance is caused by duplication of the basement membrane. This is often referred to as splitting. It usually is the result of new basement membrane synthesis in response to subendothelial deposits of immune complexes. Between the basement membrane, there is inclusion or interposition of cellular elements, which can be mesangial cells, endothelial cells, or leukocytes. Do not forget the classic description, double contour or tram track. Now, we have here IgA nephropathy, otherwise known as Buerger's disease. It is characterized by the prominent IgA deposit in the mesangium. So do not forget that the IgA deposit is in the mesangial regions, and recurrent hematuria is the most common manifestation that is seen among this patient. The disease can be suspected by light microscopy, but the diagnosis is made by visualization of the IgA deposition in the mesangium of the patient. So the disease affects people of any age. Usually it is commonly seen among children and young adults. They usually present with cross hematuria after an infection of the respiratory tract or even GI and urinary tract. They will usually have hematuria, as I have mentioned. In some cases, only microscopic hematuria is evident. It may not be accompanied by proteinuria. The hematuria typically lasts for several days and then it eventually subsides and then will return again after a few months. So many patients would maintain normal function for decades, and then eventually they will deteriorate and progress to chronic renal failure in about, this is happening in about 15 to 40% of cases. As I was saying a while ago, you need to demonstrate the characteristic location in which is the mesangium. The IgA deposits in the mesangium, and the mesangial widening may be the result of cellular proliferation, accumulation of matrix, immune deposits, or maybe a combination. So the characteristic immunofluorescent picture is being shown right now, which is the mesangial deposition of IgA. So as I have mentioned, it is often characteristically presenting with hematuria. I have already said that sometimes it is microscopic hematuria. And as I have mentioned, some of the patients will have nephritic syndrome, living a normal life, and then eventually develop CRF. Let's talk about hereditary nephritis. When you say hereditary, it refers to a group of familial renal diseases associated with mutations in collagen genes, which manifest primarily with glomerular injury. There are two diseases mentioned in your book. The first one is Alport and thin basement membrane nephropathy. So the problem here, or the commonality, is usually disease. This disease affects the type 4 collagen. So benign familial hematuria is otherwise known as thin basement membrane nephropathy. It is a fairly common hereditary familial disease, and morphologically it is characterized by diffuse thinning of the glomerular basement membrane to around 150 to 225 nanometers. The normal is around 300 to 400 nanometers. There is expected mild to moderate proteinuria. The renal function is normal and prognosis is often excellent. So the anomaly in thin basement membrane nephropathy is traced to mutations in genes encoding for, as I have said, type 4 collagen. It is often do have an autosomal inheritance, and most patients are heterozygous. On the other hand, Alport is caused by, again, mutation, as I have said, in both is type 4 collagen. However, in Alport, it results in hematuria with progression to chronic renal failure, accompanied by nerve deafness, do not forget that, eye disorders, lens dislocation, cataract, and corneal dystrophy. It is X-linked in approximately 85% of cases. Approximately 90% of the affected males will progress to ESRD before the age of 40. There are autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant pedigrees which also exist. So do not forget, it's also collagen type 4. In addition, again, you must remember that type 4 is crucial in the lens of the eye and the cochlea. So it is expected that these patients will have eye disorders and nerve deafness. So if we're going to look at it clinically, again, the usual manifestation of patients would be hematuria, the most common presenting sign, which may either be gross or microscopic. Proteinuria may develop later, and rarely the nephrotic syndrome develops. Symptoms may appear 5 to 20 years of age, and the onset of overt renal failure is seen usually at 20 to 50. The auditory defects may be subtle and may require sensitive testing. So all of this glomerulonephritis that we have discussed eventually may lead to CGN. This is an illustration of the frequency of the disease progressing into CGN. CGN is regarded as the end point or the end stage. As you can see here, I have images showing you the symmetrical contraction of bilateral kidneys, the thinned out cortex. This is actually an example of a patient with failed transplantation, so that they had to take it out. So when you study the glomerulus again, do not forget the changes that I have mentioned a while ago. You look for hyalinosis, sclerosis, basement membrane thickening, and hypercellularity. For CGN, fibrosis is often evident, and usually when there is collagen deposition, it is best to use a special stain, like for example here, which highlights it as bluish color. So let's talk about some or few glomerular lesions associated with systemic diseases that's mentioned in your book. One is lupus. So if you will recall, this is under type 2 immune complex deposition. So clinically, you would expect nephritic type. When you say nephritic, ano ulit yun? You'll have hematuria, hypertension, proteinuria, azotemia as expected manifestation. For Henoch-Schönlein purpura, this is a diseases of children, usually with purpuric skin lesions, abdominal pain, intestinal bleeding, and arthralgia, accompanied by renal abnormalities. The skin lesions often is seen on the extensor surfaces of the arms and legs. Abdominal manifestation may be in the form of pain, vomiting, and even intestinal bleeding. The renal manifestation may be in the form of nephritic or nephrotic type or a combination of both. It may be that there is a strong background of atopy in about 1/3 of patient. Okay, so that is usually, this is what we regard to as Henoch-Schönlein purpura. The other systemic disorders would be your good pasture, Wegener's granulomatosis, microscopic polyangiitis, and essential mixed cryoglobulinemia. For diabetic nephropathy, take note that advanced or end-stage kidney disease occur in as much as 40% of both type 1 and type 2 diabetics. KW lesion, Kimmel-Style-Wilson lesion is the morphologic finding that is characteristic. It is otherwise known as nodular glomerulosclerosis. Okay, let us go now to the second category. So we're done with the glomerular group. Let us go in the tubular and interstitial diseases. So if you're talking of tubular and interstitial diseases, usually it falls under two groups, either ischemic or toxic tubular injury or inflammation of the tubules, otherwise known as tubulointerstitial nephritis. Acute tubular necrosis, otherwise known as AKI, or acute tubular injury, ATI, is characterized by acute renal failure and often morphologic evidence of tubular injury in the form of necrosis of tubular epithelial cells. So again, this is otherwise known as ATI, AKI, or ATN, acute tubular necrosis. It is regarded as the most common cause of acute kidney injury. It may be due to ischemia. For example, when you have diffuse involvement of intrarenal blood vessels, such as microscopic polyangiitis, hemolytic uremic syndrome, or thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. You have direct toxic injury to the tubules, like, for example, caused by endogenous agents like myoglobin, hemoglobin. Okay? So ATI accounts for around 50% of cases of acute kidney injury. So what do we look for? ATN, it is regarded as a reversible process. It can arise in a variety of clinical setting. Often, this is due to or related to ischemia. That's why it is sometimes called as ischemic ATI. It can also be related to nephrotoxic ATI, which is caused by drugs, like, for example, gentamicin, radiographic agents, poisons, heavy metals. It can also be a combination of both ischemic and nephrotoxic. So, the critical events in both ischemic and nephrotoxic are 1, tubular cell injury, and 2, persistent and severe disturbance in blood flow. When you say tubular cell injury, the tubular epithelial cells, particularly the proximal tubules where the point of maximal reabsorption happens, are sensitive to ischemia and they are vulnerable to toxins. Several factors predispose the tubules to toxic injury. As I have said, this is the point of maximal tubular reabsorption. Ischemia causes numerous structural and functional alteration in the epithelial cells. One early reversible result is the loss of polarity due to redistribution of membrane protein, the sodium-potassium ATPase pump particularly. So when you have ischemia, the initial response would be increased sodium lowers the GFR so that you would maintain distal blood flow. However, ischemic tubular epithelial cells would express cytokines and adhesion molecules, thus recruiting leukocytes to the site and will participate in the subsequent tubular injury. Now, for number 2, disturbances in blood flow is characterized by hemodynamic alteration that will reduce the glomerular filtration rate. The major one is called intrarenal vasoconstriction. It results in both reduced glomerular blood flow and reduced oxygen delivery to the tubules in the outer medulla. Particularly, we're talking here of ascending limb and straight segment of the proximal tubules. So vasoconstriction happens, you'll have decreased sodium in the tubules as a result of decreased blood pressure, and sublethal endothelial injury is expected to happen. Now, so as I was saying, there are a lot of causes and I have enumerated this a while ago. So this is just a repetition of the rundown. So you have to know the cause because the pattern of tubular damage is somewhat dependent on the cause. Classically speaking, if it is ischemic type, okay, it can be, if it is ischemic type, the tubular necrosis is characteristically patchy. There are relatively short lengths of tubules are affected, and the proximal straight tubules and ascending loop of Henle are most vulnerable. However, if it is toxic, extensive necrosis is present along the proximal convoluted tubules. So as you can see, depending on the etiology, you have 2 patterns to observe. Is it patchy or is there extensive necrosis? If it is ischemic, often it will give you patchy necrosis. So when you do analysis of the urine, the tubular epithelial injury is usually characteristically will give you the cast. The tubular lumen by cast are expected to be present. As I have mentioned, other findings would be interstitial edema, accumulation of leukocytes are also expected. So when you're looking at the pathophysiology, if we're going to run it down again, so you determine, is it ischemic or is it toxic? So at some point, it is basically reversible. You check the urine of your patient, check the volume of your patient. The urine output is very important in the monitoring of diseases. Either it is oliguria or anuria. Now, if we're going to look at the clinical patterns, as I have mentioned, ischemic is characteristically with skip areas, while nephrotoxic will characteristically give you extensive necrosis. I told you that you have to observe the urine output because this will also guide you if your patient is going back to normal or on the road to recovery. There are 3 clinical stages. The first one is initiation. It lasts about 36 hours. It is dominated by either inciting ischemic medical, surgical, or obstetric event. Usually there is decline in urine output. There is an increase in BUN level. So you're expecting oliguria. The second is maintenance phase. It is characterized by sustained decrease in urine output around 40 to 400 ml per day. So basically you have here still oliguria, salt and water overload, increasing BUN urea, so that's uremia, and hyperkalemia. Metabolic acidosis is also expected. So in time, if you give the right form of treatment, the patient can overcome this oliguric crisis and go into recovery phase. That's why the disease is somewhat reversible. You will know that your patient is recovering if the volume of the urine is reaching around 3 liters per day. The tubules may still be damaged, but then again, the large amount of water, sodium, and potassium are lost and in the flood in your urine. Hypokalemia rather than hyperkalemia sometimes is the clinical problem for those in the recovery phase. BUN creatinine level are expected, of course, to return to normal levels, and subtle tubular functional impairment may persist for months, but most patients will eventually recover. So do not forget, up to 3 liters per day. That gives you the clue that your patient is responding. So AKI is otherwise known again as ATI, or acute tubular necrosis. It is the most common cause of acute kidney injury. Do not forget, you can have 2 types, either ischemic or toxic. So when you say AKI or ATN, again, the most obvious, it is evident in the proximal convoluted tubules. The tubular injury, as I have said, you have to note the distribution. It may be patchy or it may be diffuse. As you can see here, the cells became necrotic. They are desquamated. They may form cast. When you do your urinalysis, you will see the presence of cast. Now, tubular interstitial nephritis is a group of renal diseases. From the term itself involves inflammatory injuries of the tubules and interstitium, and it is often insidious in onset and principally manifested by azotemia. When you say acute, there is a rapid clinical onset characterized histologically by interstitial edema, accompanied by leukocytic infiltration and tubular injury. When you say chronic, there is predominance of mononuclear lymphocytes, leukocytes, interstitial fibrosis, and tubular atrophy. So those features distinguish whether you're looking at an acute or a chronic tubulointerstitial nephritis. So tubulointerstitial nephritis or disorders are distinguished clinically from the glomerular diseases by the following hallmark. Usually, you will not observe nephritic or nephrotic syndrome. The presence of defects in tubular function is what is characteristic of the disease. Okay. So let's go to the next group, and this time this is talking about infection. It is one of the most common diseases of the kidney, and it is defined as inflammation affecting the tubules, interstitium, and the pelvis. The term there is what we call as pyelonephritis. Pyelonephritis may be acute, which means it is generally caused by bacterial infection and it is associated with UTI. It may also be chronic, which is more complex. Bacterial infection is, of course, present, but there are other factors attributed to it, like vesicoureteral reflux, which may predispose to repeated bouts of infection and healing. So, pyelonephritis is often a serious complication of urinary tract infection, which affects the bladder, and that is what we call a cystitis, the kidneys and the collecting system, and this time that is what we call as pyelonephritis. So you may observe one or both in your patient. Often it is caused by gram-negative bacilli, particularly E. coli. So it goes into your kidneys by two routes. One is hematogenous and the other one is an ascending infection. The hematogenous is the less common and usually results from seeding of the kidney by bacteria from a distant foci of septicemia. For example, infective endocarditis, bronchopneumonia. Hematogenous infection is more likely to occur in the presence of ureteral obstruction for debilitated patient. Between the two, ascending is regarded as the most common form or cause of clinical pyelonephritis. So what happens here is that the first would be distal colonization of the distal urethra and introitus by the coliform bacteria. The colonization is influenced by the degree of bacterial adherence to urethral mucosal epithelial cells. So from the urethra, so this is your agent, from the urethra, it goes into your bladder. The organisms will gain entrance usually during instrumentation like catheterization. So for long-term catheterization, this usually is posing an increased risk of infection. In the absence of instrumentation, females are more commonly affected than males. This is ascribed to shorter urethra in females and the absence of antibacterial properties in prostatic fluid and hormonal changes affecting bacterial adherence to the mucosa. Now, as it goes there, so now it's in the bladder. The good thing in the bladder is that it promotes stasis. So that when there is stasis, it allows your bacteria to grow. As I have mentioned, the problem with chronic pyelonephritis is usually it exists on a background of abnormality. Like for example, one of the most common would be vesicoureteral reflux. Usually, this is characterized by incompetence that allows bacteria to ascend from the ureter into the renal pelvis. The normal ureteral insertion into the bladder is a one-way valve. So supposed to be when the urine is formed from the kidney, it goes down into your bladder, stored and out, flushed as a urine. However, if there is a problem in the angulation, it allows retrograde flow from the vesicle from your bladder and going up this time. And eventually the reflux would reach your kidney. The reflux is most often due to a congenital absence or shortening of the intravesical portion of the ureter, so that when you micturate, the portion of the ureter does not get to be compressed, so that it allows the backflow from the bladder going up. The acquired vesicoureteral reflux can result from persistent bladder atony, like in patients with spinal cord injury. So now your bacteria is going up and eventually it reaches your kidney. So when it reaches the renal parenchyma, the initial would be along the tips of the papillae, that's your intrarenal reflux. It is most common in the upper and lower poles of the kidney. This is where usually the papillae tend to be flattened and concave. So it is, how do you diagnose this? You can do a radiographic study called voiding cystourethropy, in which the bladder is filled with a dye, and then eventually the images are taken during micturition. So VUR, vesicoureteral reflux, is an entity that you should consider for patients with ascending. So how would you expect? Well, as the organism ascends, like for example, at the level of your ureter, you may find cystic cavities like this. As it goes up into your kidneys, you may see papillary necrosis, which is usually bilateral. Now, the tips or distal two-thirds of the pyramids usually will exhibit yellow necrosis. So characteristically, this is an example of papillary necrosis of the kidney and the bladder cystitis. When you look at it under the microscope, you would see marked neutrophilic exudate within the tubules and interstitial inflammation. They may tend to aggregate so that eventually you'll form perinephric abscess, which is a form, of course, of suppurative inflammation. As it heals, it develops fibrosis and scarring, so that eventually you will end up with fibrous and scar tissue formation. So acute pyelonephritis is often associated with obstruction, instrumentation, as I have mentioned, vesicoureteral reflux, sometimes even pregnancy, pre-existing renal condition, diabetes. These are some of the predisposing factors. Diabetes poses increased susceptibility to infection, neurogenic bladder dysfunction, and more frequent instrumentation are the usual predisposing causes. So what will the patient tell you? They will usually present with pain at the costovertebral angle. You will have fever, body malaise. There is often bladder irritation, so that they will complain of difficulty of urination, dysuria, urgency, and frequency. When you do the urinalysis, you're expecting leukocytes to be present, or this is what we call as pyuria. You will also see, of course, cast formation. Now, so that's acute. But if you've got repeated bouts, eventually you'll end up with chronic pyelonephritis. It is a disorder in which chronic tubulointerstitial inflammation and scarring will involve the calyces and the pelvis. So you're expecting that this time you will have irregularly scarred, kasi nga, repeated healing and fibrosis. So usually the kidneys are irregularly scarred. Usually if it is bilateral, it would be that the involvement is asymmetric. The hallmark, as I have said, do not forget, scars are expected overlying dilated, blunted, or deformed calluses. Now, the scars are expected to be present, and usually, again, they are in the upper or in the lower pole. So, morphologically, a while ago, when we're talking of acute, we're talking of neutrophils. This time, you will see predominance of lymphocytes and macrophages. Another characteristic finding would be thyroidization of the tubules. Usually, they form colloid-like material filling up the tubules, hence the term is thyroidization. There is a rare form of pyelonephritis in which there's abundance of foamy macrophages, and this is what you call as xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis. So, clinically speaking, you will have back pain still, you'll have fever, you'll have pyuria, you'll have bacteriuria, usually with repeated bouts of healing and inflammation. And as I have mentioned, eventually you'll end up with chronic pyelo. Now, xanthogranulomatous may appear as a mass-like structure, as you can see here. As I have mentioned, this is not a tumor. It is a form of chronic pyelonephritis. On the right-hand side, you would appreciate that there is abundance of foamy macrophages admixed with plasma cells, lymphocytes, and neutrophils. Again, as I have mentioned, this is a form of chronic pyelo. The usual organism implicated would be your proteus. Now, it can also be drug-induced. This is the second most common cause of acute kidney injury. How can they injure the kidney? There are three ways. The first one would be interstitial immunologic reaction. This is exemplified by acute hypersensitivity nephritis. Like for drugs, example is methicillin. They can cause acute tubular injury, and they can also cause subclinical cumulative injury to the tubules, which may actually take years to develop. So since we're talking of drug-induced, we have a number of implicated drugs as enumerated. So these are examples of drugs or drug-induced acute interstitial nephritis. They will usually begin 2 to 4 days after drug exposure. It is usually characterized by fever, eosinophilia, a rash in about 25% of patients, and renal abnormalities. So you'll have hematuria, proteinuria, and leukocyturia. Since IgE is highlighted there, that should remind you that often it may be predominantly composed or a great number of eosinophils may be appreciated. So the pathogenesis is suggestive of idiosyncratic immune mechanism. So you'll have clinical evidence of hypersensitivity. As I have mentioned, eosinophilia, rash, fever, and recurrence after re-exposure, IgE is expected to go up. Now, when we say NSAIDs, this is one of the most commonly used classes of drugs that can lead to renal injury. The complications or associated injury are already enumerated. It can be AKI, hypersensitivity type, interstitial nephritis, minimal change, or membranous nephropathy. Now, there are other tubulointerstitial diseases. One is urate nephropathy. There are 3 types that can occur among patients with hyperuricemia. It may be what you call as acute uric acid nephropathy, which is caused by precipitation of uric acid crystals in the renal tubules. This is particularly seen among individuals with leukemias or lymphomas that are undergoing chemotherapy. The second is what we call as chronic urate nephropathy or gouty nephropathy. Usually, the urate crystals are forming needle-like crystals either in the tubular lumen or in the interstitium. These may have mononuclear response and be surrounded by foreign body type of giant cells. The lesion is characteristically called tophus or tophi. And the third would be in the form of stones, which is present in 22% of individuals with gout and 42% of patients with hyperuricemia. Now, disorders with hypercalcemia, particularly those with hyperthyroidism, hyperparathyroidism, multiple myeloma, vitamin D intoxication, metastatic cancer, may have extensive degrees of calcinosis. The earliest functional defect is inability to concentrate the urine. So other tubular defects comes in with further damage. This will lead to stone formation. So calcium stones are expected to be present. Now, when you say myeloma kidney or multiple myeloma, this is otherwise known as light chain cast nephropathy. Usually, there is characteristically Bence-Jones proteinuria, and cast are expected to be present. This is what we call a Sturm-Harsfall protein. Amyloidosis may also be of the AL type, particularly in this group of patients, and light chain deposit disease. So this is what I was talking about a while ago. Those are examples of tophi or tophus. These are, again, urate deposits, which may evoke a mononuclear response. It may contain foreign body type of giant cells. I was talking about this a while ago. Again, factors would be Bence-Jones, amyloidosis, light chain disease, hypercalcemia are often present in this group of patients. Now, for bile cast nephropathy, it is impairment of renal function occurring among patients with severe or chronic liver disease. So when we're talking of liver, you have to check, of course, the bilirubin levels, which is expected to be markedly elevated. You're expecting your patients to be yellowish or jaundiced. Bile cast formation is also expected. This is known as scolemic nephrosis, particularly seen in the distal nephron segments. The tubular bile cast can range from yellowish green to red pink. Usually they have a variable degree of sloughed cells or cellular diseases. Okay. I will continue in a bit with vascular diseases.